Hello everyone, this is Pramod Nair of the Department of English, the University of Hyderabad. Our lesson today is on Edgar Allan Poe's classic short story, The Fall of the House of Usher. Our aim is to explore the Gothic elements, the themes of madness, and look at the nature of anxiety, paranoia, disease in Edgar Allan Poe's famous story. First, a little summary of the famous tale. An unnamed narrator visits the house of his childhood friend Roderick Usher. Roderick Usher lives in a huge mansion with his sister Madeline. Roderick Usher tells the unnamed narrator of the story that he suffers from hypersensitivity. He is sensitive to light, sound, smell. He hears things, he smells things that supposedly sometimes do not exist. He also informs the narrator that his sister Madeline suffers from some strange illness. After a couple of days, when the friend meets Roderick Usher informs him that his sister is now tragically dead. The body has to be buried in the family vault underneath the famous house. The narrator and Roderick Usher then take Madeline's body and move into the vaults. They bury her and seal the vault. The narrator then goes away and returns after some time to be told by Roderick Usher that maybe his sister is still alive in the tombs. But perhaps also the house itself has taken on Madeline's nature. The horror mounts. Roderick Usher believes he can hear his sister screaming, shouting, and coming for him. During that stormy evening when the narrator is being told this story, the door of the room bursts open and Madeline stands just outside. Roderick Usher screams, Madeline falls down upon him, and both brother and sister die. The narrator rushes out of the house. As he rushes out, he believes some things are changing in the house and around it. Right outside, after he steps away, he turns back to see that the house of Usher has begun to break apart. It eventually collapses on itself, which gives it the title, The Fall of the House of Usher. The first module addresses a little bit of biography about Edgar Allan Poe, the famous American short story writer. Born in 1809, died in 1849, renowned for his detective stories, his horror fiction, and his poetry, Edgar Allan Poe did not receive any formal education or training. He earned his living by writing for literary periodicals. His stories became famous and he was able to sell them and make money. His marriage to a 13-year-old cousin ended in disaster when she died of tuberculosis. Poe himself died penniless in the streets of New York City. And today, Poe is known as the originator of the closed room mystery. The pioneer of the short story, the closed room mystery is a detective story where the body in a room is apparently dead without having an intruder in the room. The rooms are closed from inside, windows, doors, everything sealed shut, and yet somebody has gotten in. This famous closed room mystery was inaugurated by Poe in a famous short story called The Murders in the Rue Morgue. His detective character, Auguste Dupin, has become now legendary and is perhaps the forerunner for Arthur Conan Doyle's classic detective Sherlock Holmes. The Fall of the House of Usher is arguably Edgar Allan Poe's most famous horror tale, but other anthologies have put together some of Poe's tales of the arabesque and the grotesque and are equally well known today. The Telltale Heart, The Black Cat, The Cask of Amontillado are well known short stories. Some of his poetry, also anthologized, recited and made famous, include poems like Annabel Lee, The Raven, and others. Films have been made around his stories, TV serials have been made around stories, fiction has been anthologized, modified into comics and other versions. Poe's obsession with the darker side of human nature, with its demonic frenzies, anxieties and paranoias, have often resulted in his being labeled a dark romantic. Poe is also famous for his fiction with very strange women characters, Madeline, Annabel Lee, Eulalie and others, all of whom are cadaver white with long dark hair. Poe's horror is primarily psychological horror. I'm distinguishing here between his horror writing and his detective fiction, and Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher is clearly in the league of horror fiction. So that was a quick introduction to Edgar Allan Poe, arguably 19th century America's most famous short story writer. The first theme which we will address here is on madness, paranoia and disease. I've already mentioned to you that the key focus in all of Poe's poetry and fiction is the darker side of human nature, the frenzies, the madnesses, the anxieties and even the hatred, made most famous by a story called The Telltale Heart. The Fall of the House of Usher deals, like all Poe tales, with human psychology and human madness. It talks about disease. Roderick Usher begins by introducing his problems to the narrator. He is hypersensitive and he describes his symptoms this way. I'm quoting here from the story. Please listen very carefully to the symptoms being described by Edgar Allan Poe. Quote, "He suffered much from a morbid acuteness of the senses. The most insipid food was alone endurable. He could wear only garments of certain texture. The odors of all flowers were oppressive. His eyes were tortured by even a faint light, and there were but peculiar sounds, and these from stringed instruments which did not inspire him with horror." The description here is of a person whose nerves are shot to pieces. They go into a frenzy at the slightest sound, at the slightest smell. It's an overworked, feverish imagination that Poe is describing. Roderick Usher also is obsessed with the idea that Madeleine is not perhaps really dead, and he seems to be convinced that he has buried her alive. Paranoia, psychiatrists tell us, means that the patient is always afraid of the world coming and impinging upon them. We have a hint of Usher's paranoia when we are told that his eyes are large, liquid and luminous beyond comparison. That's an actual quote. His eyes are, quote, large, liquid and luminous beyond comparison. The narrator is not, however, very certain of what our Roderick Usher is describing as his symptoms. He thinks of him, in fact, as a hypochondriac. The hypochondria theme is on one side. The other theme is to do with disease, decay and death. I already mentioned that Roderick Usher is obsessed with the idea that Madeleine Usher is not really dead. The blurring of the line between dead and undead, between the living and the non-living, is very clear in most of Poe's stories, and the Usher story is no different. It is possible that the symptoms in the case of Madeleine Usher describe a particular kind of epileptic fit called catalepsy. Catalepsy, documented in the 19th century, was a particularly severe form of epilepsy where bodily functions, including breathing, were minimal and wouldn't be easily noticed. Not having recourse to the sophisticated instruments which we now have, the people who suffered from cataleptic fits were often believed to be dead and were often therefore buried alive. Poe, biographers record, was obsessed with the fear of being buried alive. In fact, the story is that whenever he went to sleep, he would leave a note saying, "I'm only asleep, not dead, please do not bury me." This kind of cataleptic condition is possibly what Madeleine Usher suffers from. And the symptoms which approximate to the symptoms of death would have resulted in Madeleine Usher being assumed dead and therefore buried. What Roderick Usher is accusing himself of and saying the narrator was responsible is, we have buried somebody alive. Surely there is no evidence either way that she is genuinely dead or that she is genuinely alive. So Roderick Usher comes to the conclusion that Madeleine has only been in a fit and not completely dead. He believes that the noises he hears are Madeleine complaining to him that this is what you have done to me and that you have buried me alive. He says to the narrator, and I'm quoting again, and it's a very important claim because it takes the story ahead. "I now tell you that I heard her first feeble movements in the hollow coffin. I heard them many, many days ago. Do remember that Roderick Usher has already described his symptoms where he hears things very acutely. So whether he genuinely hears Madeleine Usher scrabbling and screaming in the coffin, we will never know, because Roderick Usher has admitted that his hearing is perhaps a little too heightened. Maybe he hears things that don't really exist. So whether Madeleine was buried alive, whether she came out of the coffin, we are not very certain. The brilliance of Poe's story is we do not know whom to trust anymore. Whether the madness is only of Roderick Usher, whether the madness is shared with Madeleine Usher, and finally, is the narrator himself infected with the same madness, with the same obsessions? We will not be able to sort this out. So that was the first theme: madness, paranoia, and disease. I now move on to Module 3, which is an examination of the Gothic elements in the fall of the House of Usher. The Gothic was a tradition of English writing that emerges from roughly the 1780s, inaugurated by Horace Walpole's novels of Anne Radcliffe, Clara Reeve, and made famous by a novel whose name has recurred in various forms from then on, Mary Shelley's classic Frankenstein. This is more or less in the same tradition. The Gothic novel was usually set in old houses, castles, and forts. The houses would have labyrinthine passages, unopened, unused rooms. It would definitely be peopled with not just humans but ghosts, spirits of the dead, devils, and demons. There would be madness, there would be insecurities, there would be anxieties. There would be murder, there would be incest, and there would be all the taboo actions that have been prohibited to mankind since the beginning of time. On many occasions, several of Poe's stories approximate to such a Gothic tale. The house, of course, is mysterious and dark. It has many rooms. It has tombs under the house, the family vault in which the dead were buried. The narrator, when he's just arrived at the door, is led through what he calls dark and intricate passages through which he is taken to eventually meet Roderick Usher. The merging between character and setting, the blurring of the line between human and inhuman or non-human, is a common feature of the Gothic tale, and Poe's House of Usher is a classic example of this. I already mentioned to you that Roderick Usher believes that Madeleine, his sister, and the house have become one. It's important to note here that in this particular story, when the humans die, the house also collapses. Towards the end, when Madeleine Usher appears and Roderick Usher and Madeleine both die, the narrator flees the house. When he's exiting the house, he turns to look at it and he discovers the Usher house is collapsing. In a sense, therefore, what do we conclude? We must conclude that the life of the humans and the life of the house are intertwined. They are part of the same continuum. When the human life ends, the house also ends. A disturbing Gothic element is the relationship between Roderick and Madeleine. Gothic novels frequently spoke about unacceptable, socially unacceptable relations. Matthew Gregory Lewis's classic novel, The Monk, spoke about incest. Shelley's poetry spoke about it as well. Unnatural, unacceptable social relations, unnatural within quotes, disturbed family relations, troubling sibling tensions are all part of the classic Gothic tale. It is perhaps possible that the Roderick-Madeleine relationship may be read in similar fashion, that the disturbed nature of their character is connected to the disturbed nature of their relationship itself. It's significant that there is no heir to the House of Usher. Madeleine does not have children because there is no reference to her ever having gotten married or bearing children. Roderick Usher is also single and does not have children. So in a sense, the Usher family line ends with the two siblings. Is it perhaps a deficiency? Is it that the lack of inheritance is what causes the house to collapse? Is it possible that the brother-sister team did not think sufficiently about the legacy they inherited? We do not know. Whether Madeleine was a successful and whether Roderick himself was a successful inheritor of the house of Usher is arguable, primarily because all legacies must be continued, must be passed on. And in the case of Gothic novels, it is the inheritance that has frequently been the subject of debate, whether it's the House of Otranto, which was Horace Walpole's great novel, whether it is Frankenstein, whether it's Clara Reeves' novels, all of them have to do with the link between family and property. In this particular story, the siblings do own the property. The sad part is that property will not be passed on. So there is a very real material economic angle to the theme of the Gothic in this particular tale. Like all good Gothic novels, the lines between the living and the dead, the living and the non-living become blurred. Dreams and nightmares also merge. The house, if you remember my earlier comment, begins to resemble its characters. Roderick Usher, in fact, complains to the narrator, "The house is watching me." And he wonders, has Madeleine now begun to haunt the house? Or, to put it differently, is the house taking on Madeleine's character? The theme of similarity and difference is inaugurated right here when Roderick Usher believes that the house is watching him. The narrator thinks the windows in the house of Usher are actually eyes, as in human eyes that watch. That's the inaugural moment of the similarity and difference theme. Roderick and Madeleine, brother and sister, are very much alike each other. Here is how the narrator describes it, and I am quoting. Quote, "A striking similitude between the brother and the sister now first arrested my attention." Unquote. So they are similar to each other. Madeleine's epileptic fit, catalepsy, is very similar to the condition of death. As the story proceeds, the madness and the loss of senses that are Madeleine's seem somehow to be also Roderick's share. That is, the madness that perhaps Madeleine Usher suffers from is now inherited by Roderick as well. It's also important to note that a strange parallel works around the narrator too. Madeleine's condition, that he has seen and has witnessed with his own eyes, is described this way, and I'm quoting again. "A sensation of stupor oppressed me as my eyes followed her retreating steps." This is remarkably similar to the Roderick Usher condition, where he has claimed that he is very sensitive to sight, sound and smell. Here is a narrator saying that he begins to experience the same kinds of things as Roderick Usher does. I'll quote that again for you. "A sensation of stupor oppressed me as my eyes followed her retreating steps." Although Roderick is certain that Madeleine Usher is not dead, we are not quite assured that Roderick understands the situation. The irony in the story, the irresolvable ending of the story, is that we cannot trust the narrator either. So the entire theme of similarity and differences, of parallels and doublings, is not just about the siblings, it's also about the narrator. The narrator, in a sense, has taken the exact same problems, anxieties and paranoias as the persons he was describing. In my next module, I would like to move on to the atmosphere and setting in Poe's tale. If you have read any Poe story, In fact, if you've read any gothic or horror story, you will immediately understand that atmosphere and setting are important, or maybe more important than the characters themselves, because the setting in fact works as a character. It has a major role in how the lives of the characters turn out. Let's start the discussion of atmosphere and setting with the house itself. The house of Usher is first described as melancholy and later as a mansion of gloom. The house and its settings only invoke fear and despair, as the narrator tells us. And I'm going to read out a couple of short descriptions of the house, mainly so that you can get a sense of the atmosphere. This is what the narrator is seeing of the house. Quote begins here. Bleak walls, upon the vacant eye-like windows, upon a few rank sedges, and upon a few white trunks of decayed trees. The precipitous brink of a black and lurid tarn that lay in unruffled luster by the dwelling, and gazed down, but with a shudder even more thrilling than before, upon the remodeled and inverted images of the grey sedge and the ghastly tree stems and the vacant and eye-like windows. Is that pleasant? Certainly not. What is the atmosphere? What is the setting being conveyed? You begin to get the sense of something haunting, something brooding, something perhaps evil and deranged. Even the family physician wears a mingled expression of low cunning and perplexity, says Poe. Poe was brilliant at creating this kind of claustrophobic, demonic, frightening atmosphere. Everything about the setting in the house of Usher induces not only a sense of claustrophobia, but a sense of imminent and impending doom. Even the paintings there are without light or any cheer. One such painting is described this way by the narrator, and I'm quoting again. A small picture presented the interior of an immensely long and rectangular vault or tunnel, with low walls, smooth, wide, and without interruption or device. Certain accessory points of the design served well to convey the idea that this excavation lay at an exceeding depth below the surface of the earth. No outlet was observed in any portion of its vast extent. No torch or other artificial source of light was discernible, yet a flood of intense rays rolled throughout and bathed the whole in a ghastly and inappropriate splendor. Look at how that description concludes. In a ghastly and inappropriate splendor. The place is entirely dark. The place is gloomy. Whatever light does permeate into this horrific joint gives it not pleasant, pleasing pallor, but a ghastly and inappropriate splendor. This sense of claustrophobia is not entirely due to the nature of the old house, its walls, the gloomy paintings, but due to the nature of the people who live there, the mad siblings, a valet, the doctor who comes in. Nobody visits the house, nobody leaves the house, which is why I described it as claustrophobic. It's a house into which nobody comes, and it's a house from which nobody goes out. The brother and the sister have only each other, and they're both ill in very different ways. So we need to see claustrophobia not as a theme connected only with the architecture of the house or the setting of the house, but also with the kind of people who live there, the relationships within the family inhabiting that particular house. And this, if you remember, is a classic Gothic theme, as I mentioned before. Roderick cannot leave the house or escape his sister's madness, and that is claustrophobia as well. My last module deals with perhaps the most problematic component of the fall of the house of Usher as a story, and that is to do with the narrator and his perceptions. The entire story is told by an unnamed narrator, which itself should warn us. Why is it that the narrator of the story is not described? We know nothing of this narrator except that he was Roderick Usher's childhood friend. We have no idea of the kind of person he is, his character. So we are seeing through the eyes of the narrator, but what the narrator sees we don't quite understand because we don't know the narrator. We have been told that Roderick Usher is hypersensitive, is anxious, hears things, sees things that don't exist. We have been told that his sister perhaps suffers from a strange malady. But let us, for a brief moment, pay careful attention to the first paragraphs of the story. In the beginning itself, it is suggested that the narrator himself may not be mentally very stable. He describes himself as experiencing a, quote, sense of insufferable gloom. A sense of insufferable gloom. Then he perceives the windows of the house as vacant eyes. This description of the eye-like windows occurs twice in the opening paragraph. Now, my question to you is, do you think the narrator is himself normal? We have been told that Roderick Usher is mad, but look at the description. When the narrator is looking at the house, its walls and the windows, he thinks of the windows as eyes looking at him, as the house is turning its face towards him and looking at him. It's a hypersensitive portrayal. He is perhaps himself slightly deranged. So the description of the vacant eyes of the house occurs twice in the opening paragraph. Then there is a series of descriptions where he speaks of, and I'm quoting here, the after dream of the reveler upon opium. He experiences, he says, an iciness, a sinking, a sickening of the heart. He meditates upon how simple natural objects causes or produces a sorrowful impression. This is how Poe introduces the narrator. Now, having been told this is the way the narrator is and this is the way the narrator perceives, let us look at the concluding paragraph where the narrator witnesses supposedly the fall of the house of Usher. The entire sequence, as in the sequence in which the narrator describes the fall of the house of Usher, is described in a series of light shade effects where it becomes difficult to be certain whether he's imagining them or they actually happen. What I'm proposing is the description of the fall of the house of Usher, which comes to us from the narrator, is suspect. Look at the images he uses. He speaks of a, quote, wild light and a gleam so unusual. He says the house's shadows were alone behind him and the night's, quote, radiance was that of the full setting and the blood red moon. I'll say that again. The radiance was that of the full setting and the blood red moon, which he says, quote, shone vividly. He then hears a loud sound which he describes as, and I'm quoting again, a long tumultuous shouting sound like the voices of 1,000 waters, and his brain, he says, reeled. Here's a narrator who sees the house windows as vacant eyes, who perceives the moon as blood red. He finds gloom in everyday objects and in the natural sounds around him, like in the sounds of the water. Given these odd or hyper-imaginative perceptions of things, we begin to wonder about the narrator, just as we have been told that the Roderick Usher story cannot be trusted. When the story ends, Roderick Usher calls out, "Madman!" Let me pose a question to you. Is he referring to himself as madman or is he referring to the narrator as madman? In other words, what I'm proposing is that Poe's story makes it very clear that we cannot trust either the narrator or the story he is telling us. Please remember, the story of the fall of the house of Usher is told to us by a narrator. We only have the narrator's point of view. We only have the narrator who tells us what has gone wrong. We only have the narrator who tells us we have buried this woman alive. Roderick Usher is sick. Madeline Usher was sick and the house fell down. So to quickly summarize, the fall of the house of Usher arguably Edgar Allan Poe's most famous, most anthologized, most revered short story, deals with themes of madness and paranoia, where the brother believes his sister is dead and has been buried, and then begins to believe that she was not dead. Roderick Usher believes that his sister has been buried alive and that, most importantly, she will come back for him. This is told to us by a narrator. The narrator describes how Madeline comes back, launches herself at Roderick Usher. They both fall down dead, and with them the house falls down as well. We spend some time looking at the Gothic elements in the story, such as the nature of the labyrinthine house, the awkward family arrangements, the question of inheritance and legacy, the definite presence of the supernatural and evil, the complicated nature of brother-sister relationships, family, the dead, the past and the present. We then looked at the way in which atmosphere and setting contribute to the tale's power, its evocative nature, whereby the house seems to assume the personality of the people living inside us. We then concluded by wondering about the narrator himself, whether we can trust the narrator given the fact that the narrator himself seems slightly deranged, unstable, mentally unreliable. The entire Edgar Allan Poe story, therefore, is not only about Usher, it's about how we perceive the world itself. Thank you.